Welcome to Foreign Policy Focus. This is episode 200. On today's show, I have Scott Horton on as a special guest for the 200th show. He's the author of Fool's Errand. He is the viewpoints editor at antiwar.com, managing director of the Libertarian Institute, where you can find this podcast and my daily news roundup. And he's also the host of his podcast, The Scott Horton Show. Scott, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great, Kyle. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, great to have you on again. I think the last time I had you on was episode 100.
And the Libertarian Institute. You're a really great addition to the site. We're really happy to have you.
Thanks so much. I love that all my content goes up there and a lot of people share it. I know when the site was down, I had a lot of people asking me about it. So it seems like people are using it and enjoying it. But I brought you on today to talk about a couple things, including the recent elections in Iraq, just because a lot of the, seems candidates in this election go back to the Iraq war and were figures back then. So I really don't know who all of them are. So I was hoping you could kind of explain to me, who this guy al-Sadr is who won the election. And, depending on what news sources you're reading, apparently he's an Iranian stooge or is going to put Iraq in the hands of Iran. So do you want to kind of explain this to me, what happened in the election here?
Yeah. Well, some people might be familiar with Muqtada al-Sadr, if not from all the accusations and all of his real crimes during Iraq War II. But they might remember from the footage of the lynching of Saddam Hussein in that barn when they hung that big rope around his neck and pushed him off that barn loft. The crowd was chanting, Muqtada, 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 as they lynched him. And there's a real reason for that. So Muqtada al-Sadr basically is kind of a working class religious leader of, basically leader of poor Shiites in Iraq. Now, there's a huge slum that's like 2 million people itself or something, million people or something in this giant slum in eastern Baghdad. It was called Saddam City until America invaded in 2003, and it was immediately renamed Sadr City. It was not named after Muqtada. It was named after his father, who is a high-ranking, a very well-respected Shiite cleric who was martyred by Saddam Hussein. His father-in-law also was a very high-ranking religious cleric who was murdered by Saddam Hussein. So Muqtada al-Sadr just had all the street credibility in the world just for being who he was. Right. He never had to do anything but show up, and he automatically had this massive following. And of course, he is a very political character and, had, lots of points of view and plenty to do and say. And so, but when he snapped his fingers and said, all you fighting age males are now my Mahdi army, they hop to and do what he says. He has this huge amount of leadership. It was one of the anecdotes I think this was in the second Bob Woodward book about Bush. There's 4 Woodward books about the Bush Jr. years. And I think it's in the second one that, Paul Bremer, the viceroy installed there, has this kind of, rich little blonde daughter of a Republican donor as his aide, right? That's her only qualification is some like political connection, right? And she's like his right-hand man running the occupation. And he says to her, who's this Muqtada al-Sadr guy? And she goes, oh, he's just some minor cleric. Cause I guess she'd at least looked him up or something, whoever she was, but no idea really who he was. Right. So, now something that's really important about the whole context of Iraq War II. And, I'll try to make this real quick cause I think people can really get this in one shot cause most people already know a lot of this. They just never hear it all put together. Right. But the reason that Jimmy Carter and Ronald Reagan backed Saddam Hussein in his invasion of Iran in 1980 and then that whole Iran-Iraq war was because when the Iranian Revolution happened in 1979, it was a Shiite revolution. It was the Ayatollah Khomeini who took over. And in Iraq, Saddam Hussein was a Sunni sitting on a minority dictatorship, lording it over the 60% super majority population of the country, the Shiite Arabs, who are predominant in all the land from Baghdad east over to Iran. So Saddam panicked when the Iranian Revolution happened. He thought it would roll right into southern Iraq. So he was trying to preempt that by invading Iran in order to basically conscript all those poor Shia and force them to invade Iran in a way to put country over religious sect. and turn that energy away from Baghdad. So at the end of that war, as we all know, Saddam had some more debts and some problems and invaded Kuwait with an American at least flashing yellow light. Go ahead. We don't care. Take the northern oil fields. And then once he did that, America fought Iraq War I to force him out of Kuwait because he ended up taking the whole country and they decided, let's have a war. So once they got him out, there was the famous, I don't know how famous, it should be famous, the uprising, the Great Bay of Pigs in the desert of 1991, when George Bush Sr. went on Voice of America and had the Air Force drop leaflets telling the Shia supermajority and the Kurds to rise up and overthrow Saddam Hussein. Now's your chance. Get him. Well, they changed their mind. And the reason they changed their mind and left all the Shia and Kurds who rose up against Saddam high and dry to be massacred by Saddam was because Iranian militias started coming across the border to take control of the Shiite uprising. And Brent Scowcroft and James Baker and Dick Cheney and George Bush Sr., the war cabinet and the Bush Sr. administration there, they realized, oops, we're importing the Iranian Revolution. We're reversing Ronald Reagan's policy that was to contain it, if not overthrow it, at least contain it and keep it in Iran. And now we're bringing it into Iraq right now. And so they called it off. And then they let Saddam keep his attack helicopters and his tanks and crush, well, what was left of his tanks anyway, and crush the uprising, killing upwards of 100,000 Shia and Kurds in that complete debacle. This then became the excuse, of course, for staying in Saudi Arabia in order to wage the no-fly zone air war against Iraq all through the Clinton years, which was the primary motive for the attack of September 11th, other than American support for Israel. And that was a big part of what got al-Qaeda to attack America, was staying in Saudi to bomb Iraq in the name of protecting these Shia, the supermajority in the South, right? Then George Bush comes. And when September 11th happens, not only does he go to Afghanistan, he decides he's going to go to Iraq for a lot of different reasons. But anyway, in effect, what he did was he picked up where his father had left off when his father betrayed the Shia in that great uprising. George Bush Jr. took their side. He invaded and he got rid of Saddam for them. And in essence, he had America fight an 8-year war for the Shiite supermajority in order to kick the Sunnis out of power and out of Baghdad, almost entirely. A massive sectarian cleansing campaign of the city to kick the Sunni Arabs out to consolidate Shiite power there. Now, what they thought was going to happen was that the Iraqi Shia were going to appreciate it so much that they were going to do whatever America wanted, and they were going to create, the kind of society the way America wanted them to do it. And that was going to put all this pressure on the Iranians. So the Iranian people would be so jealous of the lucky Iraqi Shia for having a wonderful democracy and everything that they would then overthrow their government for us. So war with Iran is maybe a little too, big of a task, but this will put all the pressure to undermine the Iranian regime. That's what Ahmed Chalabi had told Paul Wolfowitz and David Wormser and Richard Pearl, and they believed it because they're stupid. You can read, there's a great article. It's called How Chalabi Conned the Neocons. And basically he said, getting rid of Saddam for the Ayatollah Khamenei will be good for Israel, you idiots. And Richard Pearl was like, wow, really? That sounds great. So yeah, let's do it. So that was a big part of why the neocons supported the war, is they bought this line from Chalabi. Now, in effect, of course, we know that that's not what happened. We know that the Iraqi Shiite supermajority, that the political factions that America picked to put in power, the Dawa Party and the Supreme Islamic Council, that those guys were the ones who were the most tied to Iran. And that even though, America has a lot of money and military equipment to lend them, they have a religious and a sectarian kinship and a historical kinship with the Iranian Shia going back, centuries, right? 1,000 years, 1,300 years or something, right? Since the foundations of Shiism and which immediately spread into Iran. So that was a fool's errand. That was a giant mistake. It made no sense to do that, but Richard Pearl's a fool. And so, during all through Iraq War II, there was basically, when I say the supermajority Shia, I mean, that's oversimplifying, right? I don't mean the Shiite population of the country, really. I mean, the power factions that claimed leadership positions over them, right? And so there are three main legs on that stool. the Supreme Islamic Council, which had been hiding in Iran since 1980, since Jimmy Carter hired Saddam to invade Iran, the Dawa Party, which had been hiding in Iran since 1980 for 30 years, since Jimmy Carter had hired Saddam to invade Iran, and Muqtada al-Sadr and his group of men and his Mahdi army. Now, the reason that after Viceroy Bremer was gone, we've had 3 Dawa Party prime ministers there. First Jafari, then Maliki, and now Abadi. And the reason for that is because the Dawa Party never had their own army. The Supreme Islamic Council did. The Supreme Islamic Council had the Badr Corps, and the Sadrists, they had the Mahdi army, Muqtada al-Sadr's Mahdi army. And so what they did was they compromised between the Supreme Islamic Council and Sadr that they would go ahead and support a Dawa Party prime minister, and then they would basically compete to integrate their militias into the Iraqi army and make their militias the Iraqi army, which is what happened. And so, you know, you might have heard of the El Salvador option, where in 2004 and 2005, Donald Rumsfeld hired John Negroponte, who had helped run the death squads in Nicaragua back in the 1980s. And Negroponte brought in his buddy James Steele, and they helped run these Shiite death squads. They recruited the Badr Brigade of the Supreme Islamic Council, and they said, we're going to put you guys to work hunting down and killing the leaders of the Sunni-based insurgency, ex-Ba'athis and other Sunni leaders who are responsible primarily for leading the insurgency against us. And the Badr Brigade went to work then. Whenever you hear about power drills in people's heads, you know, in that movie American Sniper, Clint Eastwood makes it where the enemy is using the power drills to torture people to death. But that's not the reality. The reality is it was the Badr Brigade, the Wolf Brigade, under the control of the Americans who were doing stuff like that and cleansing, primarily Baghdad of Sunni Arabs and consolidating all that power. And so, when it comes to the Iranian question, you know, Sadr from the very beginning was resistant to America and Iran and said, look, thanks for getting Saddam for us. Now get the hell out of the country. And he meant it. And he meant to limit Iranian influence too. And, I'll get back to Cindy Sheehan's son in a minute, because this is an important part of the story. But he would routinely denounce the Supreme Islamic Council and the Dawa Party. That is, again, the parties who had literally been living in Iran for 30 years. You want to talk about who's close to Iran. These are Iran's guys. Sadr is actually from East Baghdad, you know. So he would routinely denounce them and say that they want this plan for what they call strong federalism, meaning instead of a strong national government, we'll have, you know, basically like federal states or strong autonomy for the Shiite regions, the Kurdish region, and the Sunni regions. And then that way, as he explained it, and this goes all the way back to almost the origins of the war, 2004 and 5 at least, he would routinely denounce them, saying that this is an Iranian plot. He wouldn't say this is an American plot. He would say this is an Iranian plot to basically consolidate power over eastern Iraq and to cut out the West and to basically, you know, it's basically like the Hutus versus the Tutsis. The super majority rises up and kill the Tutsis, and then what are they left with? Kind of a thing, right? They're now the minority. They used to lord it over the majority. Now they're the minority. And in Iraq, all the oil is down in the south and up in the north. It's not in the predominantly Sunni areas. It's all in the predominantly Shiite areas or in the Kurdish areas. So it was, the Sunnis had a real reason, a real incentive to control that national government. So they controlled that oil wealth and controlled all those spoils, right? So the Supreme Islamic Council plan was screw the Sunnis, just cut them loose. We got the oil. We have the capital city, and let them burn in the sun. We don't care about them. And Muqtada al-Sadr's point of view was Iraq first, not Shiism first, Iraq first. And that these Iraqi Sunnis are our fellow countrymen and we need to work something out. Now, of course, he figured that he and his friends would be dominant factions now in the new Iraq as compared to the way it was before. But he didn't want to just either kill them all or cut them all loose. He wanted to, you know, hold them together. And that was his argument against the Dawa Party and the Supreme Islamic Council. They want this strong federalism. He wants a strong national government and an alliance with the Sunnis and a compromise and an understanding, a deal to move forward, with the Sunnis. And so, but the Americans didn't want to have any of that because the Americans figured, they want to stay. And if Sadr wants to get rid of Iran, well, that's good. But if he wants to get rid of us too, then it's not. And we prefer Iran's friends because the Bush government's gamble was at the end of the day, they'll prefer us to Iran. They need our money, our military might, our everything that we can offer them that Iran can't offer them. And so at the end of the day, we'll win. But when America put those Shiite death squads, the Badr Brigade in them at the service of Donald Rumsfeld, the reality was they were putting Donald Rumsfeld and the U.S. Army and Marine Corps at the assistance of the Badr Brigade. They were basically making our guys serve these Shiite death squads. They didn't see it that way, probably. But in effect, these Shiite militias couldn't have kicked all the Sunnis out of Baghdad without the U.S. Army and Marine Corps to help them accomplish the whole thing, to help them fight this war, to pretend that the Sunni-based insurgency against the American invasion and the new Shiite government they were foisting on the country was just a bunch of terrorists who were fighting us because of how much they love terrorism and whatever these nonsensical circular substanceless arguments that say that, well, so we have to hunt down and kill the leaders of the terrorists. Instead of saying, well, we're taking the side of the Shiite supermajority against the Sunni minority, and that's why they fight, and even being realistic about who's doing what and why they're doing it. And so, America really helped with that cleansing. And so now, in the meantime, they have a real problem with Sadr because Sadr is really opposed to the American occupation. And, I'll never forget, it was the spring of 2004, March of 2004, 1 year into the war. Congressman Bob Dornan was on one of these cable news channels. I don't know if it was Fox or CNN or what. And Bob Dornan, the former congressman from Orange County, was up there saying, well, this Muqtada al-Sadr guy, if he thinks that he's going to publish this newspaper where he just says bad things about the occupation and how we need to go, he's going to have to learn that that's not tolerable and whatever. What had happened was they had shut down his newspaper for publishing anti-American op-eds. And there's Bob Dornan up there saying, well, if it saves one American life, then da-da-da. Of course, just obviously begging the question, predicting the future, as though he already knows it, that somehow shutting down this newspaper is going to, quote, save American lives. Well, of course, it didn't. It caused a massive riot and a massive battle. And Cindy Sheehan's son, Casey, was with a group of soldiers. They just made, Cindy Sheehan hated it, by the way. She said it was horrible and they didn't consult with her writer at all and whatever. But they made this mini-series based on Martha Raditz's book called The Long Road Home that they played on the Smithsonian Channel or the History Channel. That showed what happened in this ambush. And they don't really, of course, explain the politics behind it. But, the Sadrists ambushed and killed Cindy Sheehan's son along with, I think, a dozen other guys who were caught out in the open in Sadr City in response to the shutting down of his newspaper. Well, and then they sent in another group of reinforcements. And this is where Thomas Young, the young man who was shot in the spine, who, Phil Donahue made the documentary about him, and he wrote that great suicide letter to Bush and Cheney about how it should be them, not him. That Thomas Young without the H, just Tomas, suicide letter to Bush Cheney. Everybody read that thing. It's the most powerful thing in the world. And he ended up not killing himself, but in fact dying of natural causes, I think about a year later anyway. This guy, Thomas Young. But anyway, so both of those, their stories, Cindy Sheehan's story begins there in Sadr City, picking this fight with the guy that we're really ultimately fighting the war for, right? Because the United Iraqi Alliance, again, was Skiri, Dawa, and Sadr. And so Supreme Islamic Council, Dawa, and Sadr. And so here we're fighting a war for this three-legged stool of this Shiite supermajority to put them in power. At the same time, we're fighting in Najaf and in East Baghdad. We're fighting against one of the three major pillars of the group that we're fighting for. And this happened over and over again. And in fact, when the battle in Fallujah broke out, that happened right around the same time. When the battle in Fallujah broke out, Sadr sent Shiite militia guys in pickup trucks to go and help the Sunnis, to try to, to show solidarity with them, that it's all of us Iraqis, not Sunni and Shia. It's us Iraqis versus the Americans. And the Americans, of course, wouldn't have that. And so they worked all this time to try to limit the power of Muqtada al-Sadr. In 2007, they waged for about 6 or 8 months a massive war in Sadr City. There's a whole book about it called The Good Soldiers. And there's no recognition. In fact, this book is a great example. The book is by Finkel from the Washington Post. And there's one paragraph in there where Finkel says it is kind of strange that they're fighting against Sadr at the same time they're fighting for him in the larger sense. And there's one time in the book that the commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Kozlarich, who is guilty of war crimes, and I have 2 witnesses, on the record about him ordering them to massacre civilians. But anyway, Lieutenant Colonel Kozlarich at one point goes, "Oh yeah, it is kind of funny that we're fighting Sadr while at the same time we're really fighting against the Sunni for the United Iraqi Alliance that he's a part of it." Oh, well, anyway, let's get back out there, boys. And this is the way that the war was fought. And as you're saying, he came out first in the recent election. And it's because of, and by the way, I should say that when the worst of the ethnic cleansing or sectarian cleansing campaign was going on, it was right when America was fighting against Sadr. But they were fighting for him at that time too, and his groups did participate with the Badr Brigade in their massacres of Sunni civilians. I mean, if you look at late spring, early summer 2007, you're talking about 3,000-4,000 people killed a month. Sunni bodies stacked like cordwood on the side of the road every morning. I mean, it was just an absolute mess, and his guys were responsible for some of that. So I'm not sitting here trying to say the guy's a hero. I'm just trying to add a little bit of more context to the accusations. I mean, why do they hate him? Because they don't own his ass. That's why they hate him, right? Because he doesn't do what he's told, because he wanted to limit American influence. In fact, there was just a story that they sent a general or somebody over there to talk to Sadr and ask him, "Are you going to shoot at American troops?" And he said, "No, those days are over, but the days of American troops here are over too. And you guys are going to have to go." So, here we are. And, here's the other thing, right? Sorry, this is a pretty damn long answer to your question. But Obama committed high treason for years in Syria supporting the bin Ladenite terrorists there, as I know you know. And this resulted in the creation of the Islamic State, not just in eastern Syria, but just like was predicted on my show and just like was predicted in the DIA document back in 2012, this blew back into the creation of an actual Islamist state in western Iraq as well. And ISIS in 2014 rolled into Mosul, Fallujah, Ramadi, Tikrit, and created the Islamic State, the so-called Caliphate. And this resulted in Iraq War III, where then Barack Obama in summer of 2014 launched this war that only really started, basically wrapped up last fall at the end of 2017. And we had to fight a 3-year war for guess who? The Shiite supermajority and their militias, their army, and their alliance with the Iranian Quds Force again fought another war. And now all the hawks complain, "Oh my God, Iran's influence in Iraq has increased." Yeah, it increased 2 huge notches on the dial. One was turned by George Bush. The second was turned by Barack Obama. All the Ayatollah ever did was send Ahmed Chalabi to blow smoke up Paul Wolfowitz's ass about building a oil and water pipeline to Haifa. Other than that, all he did was accept, America's benevolent gifts, All
right. So getting into the, what happened in the actual election now, you just had the Iraqi government actually win this war against ISIS. And I'm sure that was, how they were portraying it to the Iraqi people. So how is it that, al-Sadr ends up winning the election? And I guess, how legitimate was the election from, what you've read and what you could tell, was voter turnout very high, stuff like that?
I think turnout was a bit lower than usual, but I talked with Elijah Magnier, and he seemed to think that it was, free and fair as it could be in Iraq anyway, and said that they even were able to vote in Fallujah, Ramadi, Mosul, and the predominantly Sunni areas that have been, Fallujah didn't get it nearly as bad as Mosul and Ramadi. But he said even in Mosul, I guess he didn't know about Ramadi, but he said up in Mosul, the city's back in business. People are, up and around, and, in the places in the old city where ISIS held out the longest, things are worse. But in most of the rest of the city, he said, things are more or less back to normal again, and they were able to participate in the election. Even the Sunni minority were able to participate in the election again. And I think, and Sadr had an alliance with the Communist Party, and I think he did get a lot of, I think it was Patrick Cockburn that was saying that he got, a lot of support from the poor, regardless of sect, from the very poor, because he promises to not be so sectarian and to try to put Iraq back together again. And, I guess I should say that, again, the guy's guilty of all kinds of murder. I'm not saying that, but we have a huge problem. Donald Rumsfeld in 2006 said, let's get the hell out of here now. And Bush fired him. That was why he fired Rumsfeld, was because Rumsfeld was finally over it and wanted to go. And he was replaced by Robert Gates, who oversaw the giant surge, the escalation in force there. But what Rumsfeld said, and of course he said it like such a patronizing jerk that nobody even got the point. He said, we have to take the training wheels off. It's like they're welfare dependent, right? He said it in such a insulting kind of way that people weren't really getting the point. And he didn't really make the point well, right? He was saying, it's up to the Iraqis to figure out security. Well, wait. It's up to which Iraqis to do what now? You know what I mean? He didn't really get it right, but he was right. Because in fact, what was going on was with the surge beginning in January of 2007, just a couple of months later, was that America was helping the Shiite militias complete the sectarian cleansing of Baghdad. They were then depriving the Shiite government, the Maliki government, of any real incentive to try to come to a reasonable accommodation with the Sunnis. Instead, we were basically creating a moral hazard for them. As I said, the U.S. wasn't using the Shiite militias. The Shiite militias were using the U.S. That was the real who's zooming who at the end of the day, right? America was the Federal Reserve creating unlimited money for the Shiites to expand their giant project, of sectarian cleansing. We're creating that moral hazard in the market of power there. And so what happened was predictable, right? The surge did work, quote unquote, at helping the Shiites win the civil war and finish the sectarian cleansing of Baghdad. But that then just created the circumstances for the rise of the Islamic State. That just put Maliki in the position where he didn't have to compromise with the leaders in Fallujah. He didn't have to let Sunni tribal chieftains into the military, into the police, and into the patronage system and all these kinds of things. As I was saying before, Maliki's attitude was just let them burn in the sun. Screw them. And so that was why Western Iraq was wide open for Islamic State to roll right in 2014. Was because Western Iraq at that point was a foreign country to Eastern Iraq, to Shiistan. And so with Sadr, then this is where I was going with this. Forgot my point for a second. With Sadr coming in now, and he's not necessarily, he's not even on the list of people. It's his guys who on his list, right? He never ran for anything. He's just a power broker behind the scenes. But if his people really are able to form the first government and not the Dawa Party guys, then at least that opens up the possibility, no guarantee, that you could have some kind of real accommodation and new alliance and new understanding between East and West there, between Eastern Iraqi Shiistan and Western Iraqi Sunnistan. Never mind the Kurds for the moment. They got their own problems. But between the Sunni and the Shia, it's been a huge question, right? What's going to happen now that Iraq War III is over and the Islamic State is destroyed? What's going to happen to Western Iraq, to predominantly Sunni Iraq? Are they going to be left to rot in the sun like the Maliki policy again? Are they just stuck in no man's land between Jordan and Syria and Iraqi Shiistan with nowhere to go but oilless desert? Or what the hell is supposed to come of them? Why were they susceptible to the rise of the Islamic State in the first place? Because they had nothing else going for them at all, So what's the future then? This is a huge question mark. And I think that, I'm trying to be optimistic about it. I think that the rise of Muqtada al-Sadr's faction could be positive because even though he does have a record of sectarian cleansing and all that, he never was the pro-Iranian guy. He was the pro-Iraqi nationalist, and I think has a real motive to try to compromise and come to accommodation with, frankly, the defeated Sunni population, to be magnanimous and defeat, at least at this point now, finally. So I'm a little bit hopeful for that. And of course, the Americans and the Iranians are pissed. They're kicking and screaming. They always work together to keep the Dawa party guys in there. But, and the Dawa guys got third. And, a body, the last time I saw the results, a body's group got third, but in second place was Amiri. Now, Miri is the leader of the Badr Brigade that is now, according to Elijah Magnier, they broke off from the Supreme Islamic Council, and they're their own separate power now. So Hakim's son from the Supreme Islamic Council is in there. But Amiri, this is Mr. Power Drill. Amiri, is the most brutal war criminal in Iraq other than George Bush and Donald Rumsfeld. And this is the guy that got second place, because his militias were able to take a lot of credit for the defeat of Islamic State in the last few years. So, he's got, a lot more political capital than I think any humanitarian on earth would like to see.
Well, it's just so interesting that, with Mike Pompeo's big speech against Iran, one of his complaints was that there's too much Iranian influence in Iraq. And now the Iraqis, voted for somebody who isn't, is less Iranian influenced. And, the Americans are still complaining about. And on that same line, do you have any idea what the status is of all the Shia militias that were fighting the Islamic State? I know that the U.S. was demanding that they fold into the Iraqi army or disband, and to what extent has that gone on? Or if they do become Iraqi army, does it really make a difference between title change? Or any ideas on what's going on there?
Yeah, well, I think the militias are not disbanding, and they are not joining the Iraqi army right now. There are enough different separate ones. And when you have these groups that have their own armies, it's really hard to convince them to go ahead and give them up, and you're right. Yeah. Look at the frustration of the Americans when the more pro-Iran guys lose to an Iraqi nationalist. And it's not that the Americans want Iranian power to be enhanced there. It's just they prefer that to an Iraqi nationalist firebrand like Sadr. I remember asking Robert Dreyfus back when, it's actually the first interview I did for Anti-War Radio in December 2006, the first anti-war radio show. But why would Bush prefer Hakim to Sadr? Because Hakim is Iran's guy. He's the Ayatollah's guy. So maybe Muqtada isn't, completely compliant, but certainly we could work with him, especially if half his motivation in life is limiting Iran's influence in the country, for crying out loud, which is, I think, what the Bush guys would like to see, right? And Dreyfus said to me, part of it is because he's a working class schlub. And Abdulaziz al-Hakim, the leader of the Supreme Islamic Council, why, he wears fine golden robes and speaks in a upper crust, Western educated, kind of a manner, in the way that the Bush people are used to doing business. That, Muqtada al-Sadr is, 7 social classes below who would be acceptable for them to even talk to. And so, they didn't look at it in terms of just who has power, but, in a Donald Trumpian way, just who do you like? Regardless of what it really is going to mean for the people in effect. And by the way, I should mention this too, because, a critic listening to this would object, and I just skipped it because I forgot. But when America went back to war with Sadr in 2007, at the height of that surge, a huge part of that was the accusation that Muqtada al-Sadr was the Iranian agent, and that's why they were going after him. And in fact, while they were trying to kill him, he fled to Iran. And while he was there, he got a higher religious rank. And they were constantly accusing him of being an Iranian cat's paw, that they were the ones who chased him into Iran in the first place. And then his special groups, so-called, break-off groups of the Mahdi army, did fight against the Americans in, the Shiite part of the Iraqi insurgency. So out of 4,500 Americans who died in Iraq War II, about 500 of them were killed by the Shia. about 4,000 killed by the Sunni-based insurgency there. And so it was during the so-called surge in the first, 2/3 or so of 2007 was the worst of this. And a big part of the propaganda, I mean, you almost couldn't overstate it. The Bush team completely dropped the phony nuclear scandal. It was like they forgot about it. Like they can't accuse Iran of two fake things at once. So they dropped the supposed secret nuclear weapons program, and they spent, a good part of 2007 accusing Iran of being behind every roadside bomb that killed an American in Iraq. And it was funny because, I was covering this in real time. And when Bush first debuted this talking point, he was accusing the Shia of arming the Sunni militias and using these EFPs to kill the Americans. When the Iranians were arming the Shiite militias who were fighting against this Sunni-based insurgency. And so the talking point came out confused because we weren't fighting any Shia at that point. And so they dropped it. And they came back to it like a year later or something. Like, oh yeah, so what it is whenever a roadside bomb goes off, blame Iran. Why? Because we said so. And then the theory was that an IED is just a roadside bomb, maybe an old artillery shell or something, right? Improvised explosive device. But an EFP, well, that's an especially Iranian super secret kind of roadside bomb that has a molten copper core that can be used to penetrate armor far more effectively than the average IED. And then just because the Americans say so, you are to believe that any time an EFP goes off, that bomb must have come from Iran. Well, it turns out that's a damn lie. And if any of them ever came from Iran, no one ever proved that the Iranian government sent them. And there may be a market in bombs, fine. But they never even proved they came from Iran at all. And in fact, and I think it was the first time I ever interviewed Patrick Cockburn, or it was the first article where I finally realized, like, I got to start reading everything this guy writes, was when in the fall of 2006, about 2 or 3 months before Bush started pushing this lie, Patrick Cockburn says, yeah, I was with some troops who found this bomb factory in southern Shiite Iraq today, in Najaf or wherever it was, and they're making these copper core, explosively formed penetrators that are so much more deadly than the average roadside bombs. And that was before they even started coming up with the lie. And he found the factory. He's like in the garage machine shop where they make these things in Iraq. And then after that, and if in fact, if you just Google my name or Google EFPs are made in Iraq by Iraqis, you'll see I have all these sources back then arguing about it, that these bombs were being made by Iraqi Shia and being used against the Americans. And it was just a damned lie of the Bush administration and David Petraeus and the rest of them that these bombs were coming from Iran. And the one time they claimed that they were going to prove it and they were going to hold a big press conference, they laid out all the weapons and the reporters came over, started looking at them, and they were like, look, I mean, this says made in Iraq right on it. And, they could just tell it was just junk. They didn't have any markers. There was no proof any of this stuff came from Iran. And they canceled the press conference. They actually would just, private, wrap that stuff up and get it out of here. And that was it. And they called the thing off. Because their big show they were going to put on was debunked before it even went on. That there was no proof that this was Iranian at all. And there are people who did massive studies on this. Phil Giraldi wrote a huge piece about it for some journal. And there are just tons of studies about this, tons of links for anybody who wants to look. 10,000 claims that these bombs came from Iran. No proof of that ever, not once. And meanwhile, at least scores of different evidences that they instead were being made, if not hundreds of different stories and so forth, showing that these bombs were being made in Iraq by Iraqis. But then, and this is one of the insane kind of paradoxes of Iraq War II. The whole damn war was fought for Iran's best friends in the Dawa party. At the bottom line, that was what the war was. And yet America refused to talk with them the whole time. Refused to work with them on this. The Iranian golden offer of 2003 was, let's be friends. Let's work together. You guys are killing the Taliban. We like killing Taliban. You guys are killing Al-Qaeda. We like killing Al-Qaeda. You guys are killing Saddam. We like killing Saddam. Let us help you to build the new government in Iraq. Let's be pals. Why aren't we? And of course, the answer is because of Israel and the neoconservatives is why. But otherwise, America's pursuing Iran's agenda in the Middle East. So what's all this strife about? You know, that was the quote the other day. I don't know if you saw this, where the Ayatollah said, you know, the Americans out of pulling out of the Iran deal and trying to get the Europeans to reinstate sanctions and all this. And the Ayatollah said, it's just like the American cartoon, Tom and Jerry. The mouse always wins. You know, the Americans don't get it. You know, the Americans are Tom, the idiot would get in the frying pan, slam right in his face. I made up that last part, but yeah.
All right. I want to shift gears a little bit and talk about Afghanistan. And of course, you know, this is the subject of your great book, A Fool's Errand. When people ask me what, you know, I recommend that book. And I've had several people come back to me after and tell me it just changed the way they look at American foreign policy, because there's just so much in there. And as you point, it's well, you know, sourced, and it's from all these mainstream sources. So they can't say, oh, this is, you know, a link to antiwar.com. It's all, you know, New York Times and stuff. So it's really changed a way, you know, like 4 or 5 people have told me in the past couple of months, it's like changed the way they view American foreign policy. And so,
wow, that's great, man.
Yeah. But, you know, I kind of want to get into what's going on today there and what the American mission is, other than fighting a drug war. And I think the only other thing I can nail down is a mission is they say they want to secure Kabul, and that's a priority of theirs, which if it is, it seems to be going terribly.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I'll tell you, I think the mission itself right now simply is hold the line, keep fighting until it's somebody else's fault, put it off, kick the can down the road, and just do, you know, try not to get too many Americans killed. But support the Afghan government enough that it doesn't completely fall apart, support its army and train up enough new guys. They have the worst attrition rates. It's just out of control. So, you know, they just want to keep training at full speed. So that way, even though guys are just taking their boots and their rifle and going home, they always have a new guy to fill in for them, supposedly. But they've always had a huge problem of ghost soldiers and of, you know, people going AWOL. You know, Army's a total disaster. You know, to oversimplify, it is overly simple, but at the same time, real experts tell me I'm right about this. So I'll go ahead and keep saying it until somebody shouts me down. That ultimately the bottom line is the USA is trying to foist a Tajik, Hazara, and Uzbek minority coalition on the plurality, not the majority, but the plurality population of the country, the Pashtuns. And even though there are some Pashtuns in the government, that doesn't equal representation in the government for the Pashtun population. It just means worse warlords closer to home when these guys are backed by Kabul and then come back to exploit them and rule them. And so, they fight. That's it. And this is a culture which, you know, honestly, I mean, I think any men in any culture who are capable of putting up a resistance in a situation like this probably would. Maybe there are some cultures and, you know, some places who just, I don't know. But, cause I don't want to like make it sound like too Orientalist or like alienist or whatever, like these are some kind of other men than regular men. At the same time, I think it is important, to point out that they, at the center of their identity as a culture is resistance to foreign invasion. You know, I'm a Texan, and Texans still to this day, some of them anyway, you know, they take the Alamo serious as hell. You know what I mean? Like that's, we Texans, we fight for our freedom, boy, and blah, 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 and the Alamo and this and that. Well, they've been through the Alamo times 100,000, times 1,000,000. They've been invaded by everybody. They're the crossroads of Eurasia. And since time immemorial, people are coming in there and trying to push them around, and they fight and resist. That's who they are. That's how they define their culture, is they are those who resist foreign intervention, a foreign occupation. And so they fight, and they've been fighting. And I mean, isn't this just as simple? If I tell you, look, the whole army is made up of the Tajiks from the north who don't even speak the same language and might as well be from Alaska or something. And the Pashtuns won't accept their rule. Doesn't that make perfect sense to you? That's the end of the argument, Kyle. That's what's going on here. America can't foist a Tajik army on a Pashtun populace. And so we lose. So we already lost. And so the war is it's the USA. It's the global superpower. So we can continue to pour arms in there, and we can continue to pour men and money in there in order to keep the TV show going, to keep the image going that America's still there. America's fighting. America's winning. We're taking it to the bad guys. We're not losing. We're not turning tail and coming home and running, but we cannot win unless, and I hate to say this because it's supposed to just sound like an automatic disqualifier, but with this president, I don't know. I mean, I really don't know what he might do or what any of these people might do. People look at history. We've had world wars where tens of millions of people were killed, in the not too recent past. But there's really nothing short of full genocide against the Pashtun population that is going to pacify them. They will not be pacified. We can kill them all with H-bombs or, just Nixon style with B-52 carpet bombing. We could obliterate them into submission, basically, where the few women and children left alive in the refugee camp surrender. But short of that, we can't. Fighting a war in the name of liberating these people, in the name of winning them over, a counterinsurgency doctrine that we are your security force. This Tajik army from the north is your security force. It's here to love you and help you and protect you from your husband and your son and your brother. Come on,
Well, I guess with that, is there ever going to be an end of the number of Tajiks who are willing to sign up to go fight in Helmand province? I mean, there has been so many people that have died down there already, and maybe they are starting to understand that it's futile, or do the Americans just provide so much money and weapons that they could bribe people into doing it anyways?
Yeah, I think it's just a matter of the money. Like I say, they have the worst attrition rates in the military, where these guys, a lot of times they just take their boots and their rifle and go home, but it's a desperately poor country, desperately poor. And so will they always be able to find somebody, in the race to the very bottom who's willing to, put on some used shoes and go march on wherever they tell them to march on? Yeah. But are the Tajiks' hearts in it? They can't wait to go down and conquer Pashtunistan for America? No, absolutely not. And look, they speak Urdu. The Pashtuns speak Pashto. These are entirely different cultures, right? It would be, this is a poor analogy, I guess, but sorta in some crazy universe, maybe you could imagine the Chinese using a Canadian army to occupy the Americans somehow if they could fund it and arm it well enough. But a Mexican army? Think the white supermajority population of America is going to accept a Mexican army that doesn't even speak their language, fighting at the behest of the Chinese, in our neighborhoods? I'm not saying we'd accept a Canadian or British occupation either, but one of people who are from across the line where they, speak a totally different language? No way. And that's what we're talking about here. In fact, this is in Robert Pape's work on suicide bombing. He says it's like a shades of gray graph where the more foreign the occupying army, the more likely the locals will use suicide attacks to drive them away. The more different your language, the more different your religion, the more different your culture, the more different your skin color from the people you're occupying, the more likely they are to resort to suicide bombing to force you to leave.
It does seem like that's one of the worst things going on right now in Kabul. There's, through the past year, many attacks that kill over 50 people, up to 100 people. And it seems right now they're targeting the voter registration centers. In fact, I read an article, I think it was in the New York Times pretty recently, where they were talking to some shopkeeper who said that the current situation in Afghanistan is actually, he's more scared than he was, when there was the warlord that was besieging the city. I think maybe it was Karzai, but I might have that name wrong. But I don't know how it could be going worse.
Right. Yeah, no, it is. It's, right now about half the country is controlled by the Taliban at night, maybe 40% in the daytime. And they don't, occasionally they'll seize a provisional capital for a few days just to show they can and then withdraw. They know better than to really try to seize the provincial capitals, but they rule the entire countryside of Pashtunistan, if you want to call it that, the predominantly Pashtun areas of the country in the south and the east. In Helmand province, Lashkar Gah is the only town that they don't control. The entire rest of the Helmand province is under their control. In Kandahar, they don't control Kandahar city, although I'm sure they have plenty of power and influence there. I guess I hadn't read anything really lately out of there. But nominally, government forces still control Kandahar city, but the whole rest of the province is under the control of the Taliban. And as even David Petraeus admitted, the government that America's created for them is this completely ridiculous, corrupt thing, where these warlords come and just have their way. They're just criminals. Where the Taliban, they are authoritarian. They always have been. Their former government was a very authoritarian government, but it was very religious, law and order based. It wasn't just, where each Taliban member gets to, extort bribes all day, every day on his own and act in any, you know what I mean? In other words, official criminality, the Taliban dealing with George Bush and stuff like that kind of thing is tolerated, of course. But at the low level, criminals were shot. They were about law and order and about having fair court systems for regular civilians who aren't a power faction and aren't in on anything, but they have a land dispute. The Taliban would go and issue religious rulings and rulings that the people, as David Petraeus again himself admitted, are far more in tune with the will and the culture of the people of Pashtunistan. The Americans come in and go, oh, here's your new court system. Do it the way we do it. And they're like, no, we don't want to do it the way you do it. The way you do is horrible. And the people that you've sent to do it to us are worse. So go away. And this is worth remarking upon, I think. The Taliban are considered to be the most barbaric cavemen, medieval, backwards, religious nuts. And they are. And yet in Afghanistan, they're the progressive party, dude. At least in the predominantly Pashtun areas, Islam and their interpretation of these religious edicts are a lot of times a more liberal system of law than the ancient Pashtunwali tribal code. And for example, and this is from Anand Gopal's work on the all-important question of whether a woman can own property, the Taliban and their religious rulings say that yes, she can. Whereas the ancient Pashtunwali code says that no, women cannot own property at all. And the Taliban are like, no, we're here to overturn the old ways and bring in, the 19th century or whatever, finally. And that might sound like a little thing unless you're a woman whose husband died and now you're not allowed to own the property that y'all lived on. This kind of thing. I mean, this is everything. This is, if you look at the fight for equal rights for women in America, their right to own property was the first thing that had to be accomplished. Their right to inherit, their right to buy and sell, their right to not be, patronized, and have their decisions made for them by male relatives or the local judge or whoever. So, this is a huge step. And the ancient Pashtunwali code, it goes back 3,000 years. It's, this ancient tribal system of customs, that, are probably among the most backwards in the world. So the Taliban, compared to that, it depends. These things are relative and comparative sometimes.
So one of the, I guess, new developments now is that apparently there's going to be a new general in charge of the war there. I don't know anything about this guy, Lieutenant General Scott Miller. Do you have any ideas, Scott, on what will change up, or if anything, with a new guy in charge, or why Trump maybe decided to make a change here?
No, you know what? I mean, Nicholson's been over there forever, and he's been in charge of the war, I think, longer than any other general's been in charge of the war there. And, according to everybody, he's the real expert, man. He's the guy who's been, through both surges and all these things. And yet he can't do anything but lose. So in the fight over whether to do the Trump surge last year, Trump repeatedly raised the question of maybe we need to get rid of Nicholson. And McMaster and Mattis and everybody said, no way, man. There ain't no American military officer who understands Afghanistan better than John Nicholson. If this guy, if we're going to do this thing, this is the guy to do it. Trump's idea is, well, if it ain't working, fire the guy and get somebody who can do it, right? Instead of recognizing, even though we already know that Donald Trump knows this, that this mission can't be won, that this war, is an equation for failure. It's set up for failure. It cannot be accomplished. And so, replacing this guy, And particularly, I don't know exactly, I don't want to shoehorn the guy too much because I don't know that much about him, but they say he's the former commander of Delta Force, which means that, all other things being equal, right? Unless this guy is some kind of extremely wise, brilliant genius or whatever. All things being equal, and standard, in the words of Robert Gates, he's looking at war through a soda straw. War is a series of night raids. War is a series of targeted assassination strikes. That's what you would expect a Delta Force commander to see war as, because that's how the Delta Force fights, right? But that can be a very myopic way of looking at things. And we can see over and over again how these guys miss the important context. I mean, I'd be willing to bet that if you could, say waterboard General Nicholson or something and force him to tell the truth, you could, get him to admit that, the mission is just keep fighting. We can't win, and we know we can't win. There was a Politico story last year about McMaster's plan where he told them that his plan was to fight for 4 more years. And after the end of 4 more years, we'll have by then beaten up on the Taliban so bad we'll be in a position of strength that we can force them to come to the table and negotiate on our terms. Now, when Obama did his surge in 2009, David Petraeus promised him the exact same results in 18 months. We're going to beat up on them so bad that in 18 months, I'm going to drag them to the table with their nose bloodied and they're going to sign my terms. Well, that did not happen. July of 2011 came and went, and the Taliban were like, yeah, right, we won, you lost, goodbye. And that did not happen. So McMaster didn't make the same mistake, making a specific promise. He goes, well, we're just going to fight until one day we're in a position of strength that we can use to lord it over the Taliban and force them to surrender on our terms, which is hilarious, of course, because they surrendered back in 2001. They didn't vow that this will be the mother of all battles. They went home. They didn't even want to fight us. It was the Americans that went out and determined to find enemies to fight and determined to put themselves at the service of various local warlords of different descriptions around the country that even created this Taliban-based insurgency to fight in the first place. And the one that now they can't defeat, and the one that has made it clear over and over again that they will not negotiate with the Americans. They keep saying, oh yeah, the Taliban, we're about to get them to negotiate. They're going to get, and this is, in a sense, this is a huge admission by the war party that I'm right, that they can't win, and they know they can't win, and they admit that they know that they can't win. All they can try to do is get in a better position of strength to negotiate with the Taliban in the future. Even though we already know all along the Taliban have said we won't negotiate as long as there are foreign troops in our country. We will fight you. We'll negotiate with the Afghan government after you are gone. And they've said that all along, and they've never changed on that. And whatever, small bit of talks they've had toward the having of talks have gone nowhere. The most negotiating the Americans ever did was with a complete imposter that they paid tens of millions of dollars, who was pretending to be Mohammed Mansour and was not even Mohammed Mansour at all, was not even Taliban at all. They don't even know who he was. He was just some guy blowing sunshine up their ass and taking all their money.
Well, that was kind of where I was going next, is that is the Taliban even united enough to negotiate with them? Because from the Andrew Cockburn article that I read in Harper's, it sounded like the Taliban now are just kind of like whoever the regional power is in Pashtunistan, and they kind of shift their alliance back and forth between whoever they need to be in the best position at the moment.
Right. I mean, so this is the thing, right? Is the traditional structure in Afghanistan is tribal leaders control Pashtunistan. The reason the Taliban took over was because in the Russian war, the Soviets killed so many Pashtuns that they just decimated their entire social structure. The tribal leaders were dead. So they were replaced in power by the worst kind of criminal warlords like Gulbuddin Hekmatyar and other former, favored warlords of the Americans from the CIA war. Well, these guys were just the worst of criminals. They had no interest in even being government at all, really even pretending to be a security force. They just had their own private armies and go around lording it over everybody and committing whatever crimes they wanted. So the Taliban then came in the mid-1990s. Some of them had fought in the war, but they weren't the Mujahideen. They were the religious leadership that came to kill off the Mujahideen finally, to isolate and marginalize the Mujahideen, to take power from them and to end the civil war. And so they were even welcome when they marched into Kabul, which is not a Pashtun city. I mean, there are Pashtuns that live there, but it's a very mixed city, a very cosmopolitan place compared to the backwoods of North Carolina, which is where these guys are from, so to speak. I mean, the Taliban really are redneck hillbillies from way out in the middle of nowhere. They come marching into the capital city. Imagine a militia of mullet-headed rednecks from Appalachia marching into Washington, D.C., right? And the population welcomed them as long as you'll get rid of the Northern Alliance, Massoud and his warlords for us. You can come on in. Because that's how bad the warlords were back then. Massoud was another former favorite CIA guy, but who turns out, in fact, was a KGB double agent playing the Americans all along. But anyway, he was the leader of the Northern Alliance. So that was where the Taliban came from. They were a religious movement. They weren't really made to be politicians in the first place. I mean, the way, and this is in the book, the way that they seized power in the first place was the civilian people, the population, some, significant number of them came to Mullah Omar in 1994 and said, please help us. These men have kidnapped our women and our children and are raping them and torturing them and stuff. Please help us. And so that was it. So at that point, Mullah Omar said, come on, everybody, grab a rifle and follow me. And they went and shot a couple of criminals and freed some women and boys who'd been kidnapped by the local warlord. And then they went on the radio station and announced, okay, the rule of law is here, and started their takeover of the country. So once America invaded, and again, this is in the book too, and they never talked about this really. I guess it was in the Wall Street Journal, but it wasn't really discussed in American media. But once America invaded, the Taliban were like, whoa, we're licked. Bye. And they just left power. Mullah Omar went home. He didn't vow that this will be the mother of all battles and we will defeat you and all of this stuff. That never happened. He quit and his government resigned. And as Anand Gopal and I forget the Wall Street Journal guy's name, the other guy, Cullison, Andrew Cullison, as they showed, the entire leadership of the Taliban government signed a letter of surrender in December of 2001, recognizing the new Karzai government and America's friendship, saying, you know what, Karzai is a Pashtun from Kandahar and a good Muslim. That's good enough for us. We recognize the new government as legitimate in our place. Now, can you imagine? Have you ever heard of any government doing that? A government being overthrown and run out of power and then saying that the government that replaced them is actually not too bad and we're going to go ahead and quit? And that was what the Taliban did. So, what we've been fighting all this time is a broad-based Pashtun insurgency, really, right? The Taliban becomes the catch-all name for it, whether the people involved in it have anything to do with the former religious government there or not. And, the Taliban, whatever is left of the former Taliban regime, does fight. They have the Quetta Shura Council, down in Pakistan where, they run things. But that doesn't mean that to directly answer your question, that does not mean that there's anything like centralized control over the entire Pashtun insurgency. So let's say that Trump decided he's going to commit half a genocide and he's going to completely just carpet bomb to death all of the population centers in Helmand and Kandahar or something, and then say, now come to the table and sign. There's nobody to come to the table and sign. There's no Tojo to give up an ultimate unconditional surrender to the Americans, because what we're talking about is nobody knows how many 100 different little militia groups, and I think that they don't really fight amongst each other that bad because they have, common enemies in the Americans and their puppets from the North. This brings us, I think, kind of to the solution here, which is for America to just leave. And none of this negotiate with the Taliban that won't negotiate. And none of this, gain some position of strength for the government in Kabul that we can't prop up in power over the South and East. But isn't it obvious that all we got to do is suggest to the Kabul government that they let Pashtunistan go? And you don't have to completely break up Afghanistan in a way that's going to cause more problems for neighboring states, conflicts, and these kinds of things. But why not just give them a hell of a lot of autonomy and just say, look, we're no longer trying to conquer you guys. shake hands. You guys promised not to march into Kabul. You know, right now, their President Ghani is trying to say, let's make the Taliban a political party and seat them in the parliament. But man, that's crazy. The Pashtun are a 40% plurality of the country. And, you know, Gulbuddin Hekmatyar and his militia, they're already in Kabul right now. You better be looking over your shoulder every day over those guys. Why invite the Taliban or any of the Pashtun-based insurgency leaders into Kabul? Why not just let them control their own territories instead of having a fight over who controls the central government? A central government that's not powerful enough to rule the whole country anyway. So it seems like if they invite the Taliban to be a political party and take part in the parliament in Kabul, you're going to end up in a real fight real soon over who controls the government in Kabul. Just let them go. But the Kabul government, of course, can't even make that decision as long as the Americans are there calling all the shots for them.
All right. Thank you so much for coming on the show today, Scott. You know, you've answered a lot of questions for me that are really going to help me, you know, going forward, especially with the Iraq stuff, because so much of that, I just, you know, wasn't reading the news every day at that time, and it's a lot harder to get back. But I do want to mention you did 2 shows on the Iraq war that were really helpful to me in understanding it. One was with John Schwarz. I think that was on the lead up and the lies getting into the war. And then you did another one with Gareth Porter, right? And that was, you know, more about the war itself. And I listened to both of those, I think twice, and they're long episodes. So if you know, have a day or a road trip or something, you know, check these episodes out and they'll be linked to in the show notes page. Scott, is there anywhere you want to send people or recommend?
No, just buy my book, Fool's Errand. It's available in audiobook now too. And thanks for asking me about solder and all that. I like talking about that stuff. I don't know if I did a very coherent job of explaining what I think's important about it all. But that, you know, Iraq War II, we all know it was wrong. Even John McCain now says it was a mistake. In other words, he was wrong all along too about it. You know, what really happened, what changed in the Middle East because of that war, and then the reactions to those changes since then, you know, those are the bottom lines. Those are the rhymes and the reason to, you know, the rest of our lifetimes of foreign policy of what's going to be going on there. Bush gave the capital of Baghdad to the Shia. They haven't ruled an Arab city since the Safavids sacked Cairo in 1100 something or other. And as the Saudi foreign minister said to John Kerry, Daesh, that is ISIS, is our response to your support for the Dawah. And so because of George Bush's giant error in 2003, not that it was an innocent mistake, it was a guilty premeditated murder plot, but it did not work out the way it was supposed to work out. And that's what's led to all these consequences. So I hope that stuff's useful for people to try to get, you know, a little bit of the broader narrative about why these different factions are fighting the way they are. And I hope it's easy for people to see then how it doesn't have to be this way. Certainly didn't have to be this way. You know, these are all unforced errors. No one forced George W. Bush to invade Iraq. Nobody forced Barack Obama to back Al-Qaeda in Syria. And these are, you know, the first one amounts to treason. The second one is outright treason. And none of this, and it doesn't have to be this way. And if people would quit believing in it and quit supporting it, then it wouldn't be this way.
All right. Thank you again, Scott. And everybody check out libertarianinstitute.org. I know you can find Scott's book there. You can find the Scott Horton Show there. You can find my podcast, Foreign Policy Focus there. You can also find Mance Rader's podcast, Free Man Beyond the Wall, who will actually be on the next episode of my show. And, you know, a lot of good stuff. Thank you so much for tuning into episode 200.
Sure. By the way, there's one more thing here. There's a new guy. Well, I lost his name. I forgot. But here it is. It's Patrick McFarlane, the Liberty Weekly podcast. He's just getting out of law school and has a radical libertarian take. And we're going to be adding his podcast to the feed up there at the Libertarian Institute as well.
Oh, that's awesome. I'm actually a pretty good friend of Pat, and I was on his live stream yesterday, and I've done his show a few times. And cool. I actually have plans for him to come on my show and talk about the FBI entrapment of these, you know, young Muslim men in the United States, since he's now got his law degree and everything. He'd break that down for us. Great.
Yeah, and that's such an important story too. All those entrapments, hundreds of them now. So yeah, that's really great. Yeah, everybody check out libertarianinstitute.org. Will Grid died, and that was a setback, but we are moving on. We do have a great stable of writers and a great stable of podcast hosts, including Kyle, of course. And so check it out. We're anti everything.
All right. Thanks, Scott.
See you, man.